Давайте.
Окей, я напишу свою бумажку.
Yeah. They are able to just beginning at like 7 months old, and they understand contextually who speaks what language very easy afterwards. And they really react well to poetry because it's like rhythmic and rhymes and like that. So I would say like she'll figure it out. Yeah, it'll take her longer to start speaking, but it's not like a cognitive like load for little kids to be exposed to a million languages. Yeah. So yeah, I think any kind of little poetry books.
No.
Children's poetry.
Second time.
Are you Polish? Yes, I'm
Oh, this is although she didn't like the cartoon for that. We also turned it on. I guess the tragedy connected to it was my favorite childhood author. I like it got somewhere. I like wrote a little letter. And then
That means we are going back to the
wow, it's just like out of all of the like celebrities you can be horribly disappointed. This is like
honestly wonderful. Yes, every
Один из 12 журнале как я по сути выписал.
Это хорошо? Почему будет большая славянская вечеринка? Это 1 мая или потому что это... Что будет 1 мая?
back to my childhood, right? That's one of my favorites, like from before that, I don't even remember that much. I mean, I remember it being
Oh yeah, Oyster was great. That's a little older, I feel like.
It is, yeah.
Like I was like 6, 7. Those were very much of their time though. I've reread some of those and it's like some of them hit and some people were like, okay, sir.
Did you ever read? He has like a big one. It's like сказка с деталями or история с деталями or something. It's an older one. I think like for 11, 12 years old, but it's so good. It's like postmodernism for kids.
Oh, I love that. О май гад, окей, значит, я из 7 персональных платистов, мой папа очень хотел, чтобы я в шахматы играла, я планирую эту книжку. Да, у меня Полугаевский был тоже платист, гроссмейстер весь из себя третий в мире был.
Очень заинтересован. Я же сейчас завтра приехал, потому что раз не будет, что ли?
Пытался
Он сказал, что не 20
раз.
Да, мой папа себе персонально играл, потом он ходит. И он был его принимали в ребят, потому что связь с Полугаевским. Но он был как бы самый самый слабый из тех ребят, потому что они выигрывали.
Главное, что когда мои дети читают,
И он в 14 лет понял, что он не потянет эмоционально, но до сих пор играет.
сейчас мне надо
Рейтинг, когда их параллельно играют,
Я слышала,
они
что
в
такое.
восторге. Мама нет. Мама очень интересно.
Ее заставили бабушка с дедушкой это делать.
Понятно.
Она, это, потому что она, это единственный человек в семье, который...
У меня папа закончил. И его пригласили в аспирантуру, потом я взялась.
пока нет.
Я даже не знала, что
Квак и жаб. Frog and toad.
я даже не знала, что есть.
Дорогие друзья, давайте потихонечку рассаживаться. У нас начало было объявлено в 6. Запасайтесь напитками, угощениями.
Можно сюда? Сяду опять.
Я в кино буду снимать.
А я? А, ты куда скучаешь?
Построя?
У вас Николь будет читать.
Да, ну возьмите любой, свободно.
А, может.
С самого начала?
Да. Еще буквально на пару минут мы подождем. И традиционный вопрос. Are there people in the room who do not understand Russian? There are these people.
Yes, we will do it in English.
А расскажите мне о третьем круге.
Третий друг наш человек из Тамиздата,
Ага.
бывший студент, аспирант,
Ага.
захотелось почитать английский.
Ну хорошо, я просто буду делать маленький интродакшн, я хотела ее представить. Николь Бонус. Очень приятно. Мы кого-то еще ждем?
Я это специально сделала. Из-за этого. Для тебя.
Зеленый успокаивает.
Это то же самое сделано.
Может, спросить случки и рассказать.
Оля, там первую лекцию.
Да.
No, it's okay. I'll set it up. Okay, language check. I think
English.
we've done it. English.
Our
Okay.
working language.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Welcome to Globus Books. Thank you for joining us tonight. I have two standard short announcements before we begin. And the first one, of course, please make sure all the phones were silent. Thank you. Thanks. Second, we're live streaming this event on our YouTube channel, Globus Books. Our viewers online, you have a chance to ask your question in the chat. But I also like to remind that each and one of you can help to spread the information and help our authors and books reach their audience by sharing the videos, liking, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. Another good news, now you can follow our events on website of very interesting initiative that called Слова вне себя, roughly translated words outside themselves. This is a group of beautiful people that post about books, Russophone books, and events outside Russia. If you can associate yourself with them, please, I'm pretty sure you can find a lot of interesting and useful information there. So I think something about a year ago, we already met with approximately that exactly people, class and people for discussion and for talk about Tamizdat as a phenomenon. We discussed the major works that in Russian we have the saying, in Russian language the saying, had an effect of bomb explosion. So today is 2025, and what do we have? Bombs are exploding, and it's not a metaphor. Authors in Russia, Belarus, and other countries being labeled with inner agents, extremists, and terrorists. They're sentenced to real prison time. Their works are banned from printing in Russia. And I have a couple books for display. You can find there such criminals as Boris Akunin, Gluchovsky, Sorokin with his heritage. In fact, we have a book that's been printed in Russia, which is literally a bibliographical rarity right now. It's impossible to find it there anymore. But I think the best example of censorship is this book by Maria Stepanova called Focus. It came both in Russia and one of the Scandinavian countries. And how can you know that your copy is printed in Russia? Well, pretty easy. You can see those blackout lines. And as you can guess, if their words war, Ukraine, or any kind of criticizing of your country, you cannot read it. You're not allowed to read it. And unfortunately, that applies not only for the authors and literature that stands against the war in Ukraine or recent, the regime in Russia right now, but also works that qualify as LGBT material. And I think the cherry on top is this book by, biography of Pasolini that you won't be able to read because, of this. But this is definitely, the best example of what's happening with censorship in the literature in Russia. Sorry, I don't know. We're a bit worried, but anyway, today we're going to be talking about Tamizdat, then and now. Somehow, at the end of 2024, Tamizdat and banned literature, Soviet literature during the Cold War, was published in Russia in Russian language. And it's pretty interesting and symbolic at the same time, because 2024 celebrates 100 years of Tamizdat, because we all know it started in 1924, was the items we printed outside the Soviet Union. And as been announced, we'll be presenting the first book issued by Tamizdat Project. It's some kind of dedication to all the dissidents in Russia and anywhere else. A book by Abram Terca. It's called Pkhence. This is a bilingual edition, and I cannot help but mention that it's been done by another good friend, Ainsley Morris, a wonderful, talented translator who just been here a couple weeks ago, reading her translations of Maria Galina together with Polina. So with the help of our friends and longtime supporters, today's discussion will be led by Yašoj Klocem, a philologist, professor of Hunter College, translator, and founder and president of Tamizdat Project. Nicole, she's a former student
of Yasha's, current student of Polina's.
Which explains sitting on two sides of Nicole.
This is how we are dealing with our students.
Yeah, a long-time supporter and big friend, poet, a writer, a translator, a scholar, and a recent Berkeley professor, Polinej Barskovой. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good evening. Thank you so much, as usual, for coming to the absolutely best space of San Francisco. So, as Anastasia declared, today we are celebrating things and we are marking things, and I guess also we are mourning things all in one. And whatever we're doing, it's better to do it together, I guess. Mentioned Tamizdat Project. It's been around for some time now, and many things happened, which is one of the topics of our discussion earlier today. Yasha, in conversation, said that new Tamizdat is a coinage that one can find somewhat problematic, and I'll ask him why later. But nevertheless, this phenomenon is obviously upon us. There are new and new forms of publishing, there are new books, there are new discussions about what's going on. And what Anastasia just shown us as this plashki, what we ironically call the new form of blackout poetry. It's actually maybe one of the best/worst symbols of our times if you are a reader. But the actual point of our celebration today is this beautiful emerald book with the untranslatable and almost unpronounceable title of Pkhence. And it is the first book published by the Tamizdat Project, which means that now it's also a publishing entity.
So we're saying house, which we don't
Right.
have a house.
So I guess as a starting point, it would be useful just to ask Yasha why Pkhentz.
Thank you. Indeed. But this is the exact same question that Nicole asked me, and I very well remember this moment when we were taking a leisurely walk somewhere, and Nicole asked the same. So this book, which is our first book, was of course absolutely unplanned. It just happened. And the major reason, I guess, for it to happen was, and these Ainsley Morse, whom Nastya mentioned, simply it turned out in a casual conversation between me and Ainsley that this was one little text that she has always dreamt of translating into English since her times as an undergraduate student. So, and needless to say, this is not a new 1957. So it's like double, triple belated as a standalone separate book edition. It was never published as a separate book. And the English translation that we all used to teach until this little book appeared literally 3 months ago also goes back to 1966 and has never been until now republished or retranslated. So these are probably more practical reasons, just explaining the birth of this baby of ours. But behind it, of course, stands the text itself, its story, the story of its fictional author mentioned on the title of the cover. If you open the title page, of course, you see Abram Terca, who never existed, and only where we have to indicate whose copyright it is Yegor Sinyavsky, the son of Andrei Sinyavsky, who lives in Paris and is a French author himself. So, of course, it's a question why a new publishing house, as I guess we may be called, starts with something that is as old as 1957. Again, there are many explanations to this. Part of it is that really there is no shortage of new Tamizdat Russian language publishing houses today. And their number grows exponentially with literally as we speak. There are at least 30 as of today. And all these publishing houses, except maybe 2, which are a bit older, the absolute majority of them are less than 2 years old. Most of them are based in Europe, but also in Israel. And of course, what they publish is, well, Sorokin would be a classic. Mostly, these are books being written today, and of course, having to do with what goes on today. It's absolutely organic and, of course, natural process. What goes on today requires reflection, which kind of explains why there are perhaps most of these books are nonfiction. Only very recently, maybe the last 6 months or so, there has been an increase of fiction, of novels. Of course, there has always in the past 3 years, if we talk about this period when the world changed, for us at least, right? The first was poetry, which I'm sure most of you have seen, these anthologies of Russian language anti-war poetry published by Pabil Books Berlin, but also, and very importantly, by издательство Ивана Лимбаха in St. Petersburg. Yeah, but apart from poetry, it's been mostly nonfiction. Essayism, it's too early for memoirs, but kind of travelogues, diaries
Lots of
sorts.
diaries.
Yes. Yeah, and autofiction, which is a new coinage. So back in the days, when Tamizdat existed as a Cold War phenomenon, there was no such term as autofiction. So it only tells us, sorry, that new reality, of course, does generate new genres. Autofiction, perhaps, being one proof of that. But back to this question by Pkhence, and not yet another autofiction, whoever its author would be, or whatever, or historical periods it would be dealing with. The more events we have like this, and the more time passes since its publication, which means the more we see the response to this little short story from 1957, the more I think this unplanned book was, precisely because it was unplanned, I think it got captured something very important and very imperceptible at first. It will become, I'm sure, much more clear after we read a few passages. Nicole will read the English translation by Ainsley. Ainsley is Southern California, is not here physically today, and Polina will read the originals. But to kind of foreshadow what you are about to hear, and not to spoil it, it's a text that deals with any kind of experience you can only imagine, right? And if only because its protagonist is extraterrestrial character, an alien, and therefore is, in a sense, timeless. Timeless being fictional. So it's a powerful allegory, and its power is in its detachment, right, from the earthly reality. And as one critic who wrote about Pkhence back in the days said, that it took an alien to alienate the Soviet experience, but much further, it took an alien to alienate any human experience, of course. So it goes back into history, it goes forward into history. It is very much about the time when this text was written and when it is roughly set. We don't have any clear...
Which is when?
Same time. We don't have any clear time markers, but of course the Soviet communal apartment where this alien has to live.
When was it written?
1957. Where he has to live for 32 years. That's what we know from the plot of the story, for what the protagonist has to say about his experience. This makes it 1925, right? So it works on both planes, right? It works on the plane of historical reality of the Soviet century from 1925, which happens to be the birth year of Andrei Sinyavsky. But if you think of it, it also happens to be the year of Stalinism, when Stalin starts to consolidate power soon after Lenin's death. So Andrei Kazimirovich Sushinsky, which is the earthly name of the protagonist, of the alien, lives on Earth and in the communal apartment in Moscow for 32 years, which means that he is writing after Stalin's death and during the first warmest years of the so-called thaw, Khrushchev's thaw. But what also happens is that, of course, this book could not be published in the Soviet Union until much, much later. And that year, when it first sees the light of day at home, in Russian, but published in Russia, still in the Soviet Union, happens to be 1989. And if anyone is good enough with basic math, it makes the same 32 years until it's kind of homecoming, which is quite paranormal. Obviously, even fantastic realist Andrei Sinyavsky could not have programmed this right into the afterlife or the life of his narrative, but it just so happens. So today, it resonates on many levels, including thematic and aesthetic, formal levels, I think, as if it is yet another kind of homecoming of sorts of Pkhentz, because it includes themes that clearly in the past 10 or especially 3 years have become, to put it mildly, topical. And that is not only the experience of an alien, that has always been topical, of course, but it is the experience of Soviet dissidents. It's the experience of political imprisonment. And again, we can discuss this more interestingly, I think, after we hear a few passages. It is the experience of the queer community in Russia and beyond, but in Russia, of course, it is what is criminalized most of all today by Putin's laws that are not 3 years old, but at least 10, of course, only intensifying. Yeah, and the experience of the Russian, or arguably any emigration. So this is kind of running a little ahead of our conversation about Pkhentz, but these are just kind of the flags I wanted to put in front of us and keep in the background of our conversation.
Wonderful. Also, I think before we read and before we just put you into this prose, I would like to say a couple of things about Sinyavsky. You just heard a wonderful introduction to the problem of Abram Terza, but the person behind, I think, is a very high quality ghost for our Sabrania, for us together here. Andrei Sinyavsky was a literary scholar, a nerd, absolutely botanic. He started as a young scholar, student, writing about Mayakovsky. Had very promising career ahead of him until his path of subversion actually began, and some kind of, classical Russian story of doubling. In addition to being a scholar, very solid and all that, he began writing his own prose, often phantasmatic, as Yasha said. And I think this duality between being a scholar and being the one who comes up with stuff is somehow crucial, because for us, not only he's the author of what, if I had to answer this question, I would say that this is just one of the best novellas written in Russian in terms of genre. If one would ask me it's an interesting conversation, what is novella versus short story versus tales, things like that. And sometimes it's just easier to give an example. Well, this is novella at its perfection for some reason. A tiny, tiny embryo of a novel that lives and breathes. But also, Sinyavsky, I think, is the author of the texts about Russian literature that exist on this curious raw suture between literature and imagination. His texts, of course, about Pushkin and about Gogol and about Rozanov, each of them being a scandal, being an acceptance for the literary and scholarly society. and basically making fun of us and always provoking. His whole existence, his poetics, his work of research, cum imagination, being somehow about mission against boredom of the literary statehood. So bear with us. We'll give you something, hopefully around 18 minutes of prose. We can do it. And you can do it. And it will give you some very special power of feeling yourself in his style. Because again, at the end of the day, with his incredible and all that, first, Pkhенц Terza is the prince of Russian style. And I think somehow this is crucial. So yes, reading that globus, reading. Вы давно оттуда? Спросил я напрямик, когда мы остались одни, и только оцепенелый ребенок сидел в дальнем углу с тупым загадочным взором, изображающим ужас. Откуда? Оттуда. Уклонился он от ответа. Вместе с уходом хозяйки его наигранную веселость как рукой сняло. Исчезла вся эта шутовская амбиция, присущая большинству горбунов, которые достаточно умны, чтобы прятать свою спину, и достаточно горды, чтобы от нее не страдать. Но мне казалось, что он еще не пришел в себя и по инерции с усталым видом продолжает притворяться не тем, кем он был на самом деле. «Бросьте», — сказал я тихо, — «я узнал вас с первого взгляда. Мы же с вами из одних мест, так сказать, родственники». «Пхенц, — напомнил я шепотом священное для нас обоих имя. «Как вы сказали?» «Знаете, вы мне тоже показались немного знакомы. Где же я мог вас видеть?» Он тер лоб, морщился, кривил губы. Его лицо имело почти человеческую подвижность, и я вновь позавидовал этой поразительной тренировочной технике, хотя осторожные повадки его начинали меня раздражать. «Ба!» — вскричал он, продолжая валять дурака. «Вы в системе глав бумсбыта не служили? Там директором в 44-м Яков Соломонович Зак, симпатичный такой еврейчик». «Никакого Зака я не знаю», — ответил я сухо. «Но я хорошо знаю, что вы, Леопольд Сергеевич, вовсе не Леопольд Сергеевич, и никакой вы не горбун, хотя тычете всюду свой горб. И вообще довольно кривляний. В конце концов, я ничуть не меньше рискую, чем рискуете вы». Он буквально осатанел. «Как вы смеете, — говорит, — мне указывать, кто я такой, испортить мои отношения с хозяйкой, да еще грубить? Да вы найдите, — говорит, — сначала такую роскошную женщину, а потом рассуждайте о моем физическом недостатке. Вы горбатее меня, слышите, вы еще гнуснее. Урод, горбун, калека несчастный». Вдруг он рассмеялся и хлопнул себя по макушке. «Вспомнил, я вас видел в прачечной. Мы с вами только тем и похожи, что сдаем белье в одну общую стирку». На этот раз я поверил в его искренность. Нет, он действительно мнил себя Леопольдом Сергеевичем. Он слишком вошел в роль, одичал, очеловечился, чересчур уподобился окружающей обстановке и поддался чужому влиянию. Он забыл свое прежнее имя, предал далекую родину, и если ему не помочь, он в 2 счета погибнет. Я схватил его за плечи и осторожно потряс. Я тряс его и уговаривал дружески, по-хорошему. вспомнить, поднатужиться и вспомнить, вернуться к себе самому. И зачем ему это издающее ядовитый запах кострицкое? Даже среди людей скотоложество не пользуется авторитетом, тем более измена родине, хоть не по злому умыслу, а по обыкновенной забывчивости. «Пхенц, Пхенц», твердил я ему и повторял другие слова, какие сам еще помнил. Вдруг сквозь его бастоновый пиджак до меня донеслась неизвестно откуда взявшаяся теплота. Все жарче и жарче делались его плечи, такие же горячие, как рука Веры. 1000 других горячих рук, с которыми я предпочитаю здороваться за руку. «Простите», — сказал я и разжал пальцы. «Мне кажется, вышла ошибка. Досадное недоразумение. Я, видите ли, как бы вам это объяснить?» Подвержен нервным припадкам. Тут я услышал страшный грохот и обернулся. Позади на почтительном расстоянии скакал ребенок, угрожая саблей. «Пусти Леопольда!» — кричал он. «Эй, ты, пусти Леопольда! Его моя мама любит. Он мой папа. Мой, а не твой Леопольд». Сомнений быть не могло. Я обознался. Это был человек. Самый нормальный человек. Хоть и горбатый.
I'm now going to read from Ainsley Morse's wonderful English translation. How long since you came from there? I asked directly, when we were left alone with only the stupefied child sitting in the far corner, its dull, mysterious gaze projecting pure horror. Came from where? He avoided answering. With the departure of the mistress, his famed cheer had disappeared without a trace. Gone was all that jesterly ambition common to most hunchbacks who are clever enough to hide their backs and proud enough not to suffer from them. But it seemed to me that he had not yet collected himself, and that he was warily, mechanically continuing to pretend to be someone other than who he actually was. Drop it, I said quietly. I knew who you were from the moment I saw you. You and I are from the same place, after all, relatives of a sort. Pkhence, Pkhence, I whispered, reminding him of the name sacred to us both. What did you say? You know, you seemed somehow familiar to me as well. Where could I have seen you before? He rubbed his forehead, wrinkled his brow, twisted his lips. His face had a nearly human mobility. Cautious manner was starting to get on my nerves. Bah, he cried, still playing the fool. Did you work at the main disc stop system? The director in 44 was Yakov Solomonovich Zak, a nice-looking little Jew. I don't know any Zaks, I answered coolly. But I do know quite well that you, Leopold Sergeyevich, are no Leopold Sergeyevich at all. And you're no hunchback, though you show off your hump all over the place. Enough of these antics now. After all, I'm risking no less than you in this situation. He literally flew into a rage. How dare you, he said. How dare you tell me who I am? Sabotaging my relationship with the mistress and rude in the bargain. You go find a deluxe woman like that, he said. And then you can talk to me about my physical defects. You're more hunch than me. You hear? You're more disgusting. Freak, hunchback, miserable cripple. Suddenly, he started laughing and slapped himself on the forehead. Now I remember. I saw you at the laundromat. The only thing we have in common is we drop our laundry at the same place. This time I believed he was sincere. No, he really did think that he was Leopold Sergeyevich. He had gone too deep into the role, gone feral, gone human, adapted too well to the hostile environment and succumbed to outside influence. He had forgotten his old name, betrayed his far-off motherland. Without help, he would perish in no time at all. I grabbed his shoulders and carefully shook him. I shook him and, in friendly fashion, coaxed him to remember, to make the effort to remember, to return to his true self. And why would he want this Kostritska and her poisonous fumes? Even among humans, bestiality does not command much authority. Still more so betrayal of the motherland, even when through ordinary forgetfulness rather than ill intent. Pchenius, Pchenius, I repeated to him, along with the other words I could still remember. Suddenly, through his woolen suit jacket, I felt warmth coming from an unclear source. His shoulders were becoming hotter and hotter, just as hot as the hand of Veronica, like the 1,000 of other hot hands that I preferred not to press in greeting. I'm sorry, I said, and spread my fingers. I think I have made a mistake, an unfortunate misunderstanding. You see, how can I explain it? I have a tendency to nervous episodes. At this point, I heard a terrible roar and turned around. From behind, at a respectful distance, the child was leaping around, threatening me with a saber. Let Leopold go, it cried. Hey, you there! Let Leopold go! My mama loves him. He is my papa, mine, and not your Leopold. There could be no doubt. I had misrecognized him. This was a human. A perfectly normal human, albeit hunchbacked.
And we continue, right?
Maybe this passage, I thought, is a good time to just give it a little thought, just whose text it is, like whose story I'll be reading and who is telling it. And, well, it is everything that this text consists of is, of course, Andrei Kazimirovich Sushinsky's own non-fiction, right, or memoir, or diary, rather, or a journal, which on this genre level, of course, is resonant, right? It is not just a first-person narrative, but it also is a text that he is completely dissatisfied with, as we learn towards the end, and moreover, is even going to burn down, together with kind of his self-immolation, if you like. Another twist on the proverbial manuscripts don't burn, and also an act of political protest, such as self-immolation. So rather heavy historical tradition allegorized here by an alien character who has no historical kind of background whatsoever. And of course, Leopold Sergeyevich, there is a fascinating book about the poetics of Abram Terz called Abram Terz and the Poetics of Crime by Catherine Nepomniachtchi, where she interprets this encounter with Leopold Sergeyevich, a regular human Soviet hunchback, who moreover actually almost turns him into the authorities. Not only is he not from there, as Andrei, our alien, thinks. Catherine Nepomniachtchi interprets this Sergeyevich patronymic as kind of a Pushkin-like reference. So it is a text very much about literature. If only because Pchenius and Terz are kind of similar, and Terz is a pen name that comes from a famous song of Odessa of the 1920s about a criminal, a Jewish thug, popular in Isaac Babel's tales, of course. Yeah, so but most importantly, we will read another passage at the very end, right, of Pchenius as a narrative, where it kind of turns against itself, right? The story becomes the reason for its destruction. And it is, of course, a crime, or a moral crime, right? To destroy a manuscript, as Soviet dissidents would have it. And we talked recently with Polina students about just what Sofia Petrovna does by the same way of preserving the manuscript rather than destroying it. And this tells us volumes just how different this work is from your kind of conventional dissident literature, which is all about preservation. But apparently it's it's not longer. Okay, so.
And also maybe for our further discussion, that Pхенц writes itself into a very curious tradition that we call with admiration, but maybe also with certain resistance, Soviet sci-fi. Мир советской фантастики. Right? Синявский decides with the obvious effect of estrangement that we already all witnessed for a moment in a conversation with Leonid Sergeyevich, why this genre, why this mode of... I am still kind of musing about this. Obviously, it's a game. It's an exercise. It's a parody. We'll read the last part, which is one of my favorites. Again, I think a rather strong quality of this text being funny and sad at the same time, and also disgusting and sweetly poisoning, отвратительный и прелестный, in its every word almost. Беготня и суматоха в природе, все в нервозе. Торопливо лезут листья, отрывисто поют воробьи. Дети спешат на экзамены в школу и в техникум. Голоса нянек на дворе визгливы, истеричны, и воздух с душком. Повсюду в небольшой дозировке растворен запах кострицкой. Даже кактусы на подоконнике по утрам пахнут лимоном. Не забыть перед отъездом кактусы подарить Веронике. Боюсь, последняя болезнь меня доконала. Она не только сломила тело, но и искалечила душу. Странные желания порой посещают меня, то тянет в кино, то хочется сыграть в шашки с мужем Вероники Григорьевны. Говорят, он отлично играет в шашки и шахматы. Перечел свои записки и остался недоволен. Здесь в каждой фразе влияние чужеродной среды. Кому нужна эта болтовня на местном диалекте? Не забыть и сжечь перед отъездом. Ведь людям я не собираюсь показывать, а наши все равно не прочтут. И ничего обо мне не узнают. Наши и не залетят никогда в такую несусветную даль, в такую дичь. Мне все труднее становится припоминать прошлое. От родного языка уцелело только несколько слов. Я даже думать разучился по-своему, а не только писать и говорить. Что-то прекрасное помню. А что именно, сам не знаю. Иногда мне кажется, что у меня на родине остались дети. Этакие пышные, как тусят. Не забыть отдать Веронике. Теперь они должно быть большенькие. Вася ходит в школу. Почему в школу? Он уже взрослый, солидный, стал инженером. Маша вышла замуж. Господи, Господи, я, кажется, становлюсь человеком. Нет. Не для того я мучился 32 года, не для того страдал зимой без воды на жестком диване. Зачем было выздоравливать, если не с единственной целью, как станет тепло, укрыться в тихом месте и умереть без скандала? Только так и можно сберечь, что еще осталось. Все готово к отъезду. Плацкартный билет до Иркутска, бидон для воды, изрядная сумма денег. Почти вся зимняя пенсия на сберкнижке хранится. не тратился ни на шубу, ни на трамваи, троллейбусы. Здесь за все это время в кино не был ни разу. Я за квартиру бросил платить уже 3-й месяц. Всего 1657 рублей. Послезавтра, когда улягутся, уйду незаметно из дома в такси на вокзал, а там ту-ту, поминай, как звали, леса, леса, зеленые, как тело матери, примут и укроют меня. Уж как-нибудь доберусь. Частично лодку нанять, примерно 350 километров. А все по реке, вода под боком, хоть 3 раза в день обливайся. Яма была, разыщу. Мы яму пробили, когда упали, обложить дровами. Можжевельник, что порох. Усядусь в яму, развяжусь, распояшусь и стану ждать. И чтобы ни одной человеческой мысли, ни одного слова на чужом наречии. А как начнутся заморозки и пойму, что время приспело, одной спички хватит, ничего не останется. Но до этого будет долго, будет много теплых, много добрых ночей, и в летнем небе много звезд. Какая из них? Неизвестно. Буду на все смотреть вместе и поочередно, смотреть во все глаза. Какая-нибудь, да моя. О, Родина! Пхенц! Гагры тужраскип! Я иду к тебе. Гагры, 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 тужраскип! Тужраскип! Бонжур! Гутен абенд! Тужраскип! Бу-бу-бу! Мяу-мяу! Пхенц!
A terrible hustle and bustle in nature. Neurosis everywhere. Leaves rushing to drop. Sparrows singing spasmodically. Children rushing to exams at the schools and technical colleges. The voices of nannies in the yards, shrieky and hysterical. Even the air is stale. The kastritskaya odor in small doses has suffused everything. Even the cactuses on the windowsill smell like lemon in the mornings. I mustn't forget to give Veronica my cactuses before I leave. I'm afraid the final illness has gotten to me. It has not only broken my body, but also crippled my soul. Strange desires occasionally visit me. Sometimes I feel like going to the movies. Other times I want to play checkers with Veronica's husband. I hear he's very good at checkers and chess. I reread my notes and am unsatisfied. Every phrase shows the influence of the foreign environment. Who needs this empty chatter in the local dialect? I must remember to burn it all before I leave. I don't plan to show it to humans after all. And my people won't read it and don't know anything about me anyway. My people will never end up in this unimaginable wilderness, this savage place. It's becoming ever more difficult for me to remember the past. Only a few words remain of my native tongue. I've even forgotten how to think like we do, let alone write or speak. I remember something exquisite, but what? I just don't know. Sometimes it seems to me that I had children back home, lovely, lush cactus babies. Can't forget to give them to Veronica. They must be very big by now. Vice is in school already. What school? He's already all grown up, an engineer. And Masha's gotten married. Lord, I seem to be becoming a human. No, I didn't suffer for 32 years for this. Didn't agonize all winter with no water on a hard couch. Why did I bother getting better if not to achieve one sole aim? When it gets warm, I will take refuge in a quiet place and die without any fuss. This is the only way to save what little I have left. Everything is ready for my departure. A second-class ticket to Yakutsk, a tub for water, a large sum of money. Nearly all my winter pension is left in savings. I didn't spend it on a fur coat or trams and buses. All these years, I haven't been to the movies once, and I haven't paid for my apartment for the past 3 months. Altogether, I have 1,657 rubles. The day after tomorrow, when everyone goes to bed, I will leave the house inconspicuously, take a taxi, and off to the train station. And there, choo-choo, and I'll disappear without a trace. The woods, green as my mother's body, will take me in and hide me. I'll get there somehow. Hire a boat for part of the way. It's about 350 kilometers. Along the river, all the way, practically in the water. Douse yourself 3 times a day, if you like. There was a crater. I'll find it. We made a crater when we crashed. I'll line it with wood. Setter, it's like tinder. I'll settle down in my pit, undo all the ties and straps, and start waiting. And let no human thought, no word in a foreign tongue enter my brain. And when the frosts begin, and I understand that the time has come, 1 match should do it. Nothing will remain. But it will be a good while before that moment comes. There will be many warm and good nights, and many stars in the summer sky. Which one of them? Who knows? I will watch them all together and one by one, with all my eyes wide open. One of them must be mine. Oh, homeland, Pchenц, Gogre Tujuroskip, I'm coming home. Gogre, 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 Tujuroskip. Bonjour, guten Abend, Tujuroskip, blah, 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 meow, meow, Pchenц.
So, while you're preparing, brewing yogurts of surprise, protest, love towards this completely crazy text, I will ask Yash a couple of more questions. Yash, how and why immigration that is of interest to you?
Thank you. Again, if there is any historical background to this text, it makes it the same, roughly the same year, mid-1920s, first half of the 1920s, since, as Nastya mentioned, well, which is exactly a century today. But this is about as long as Pchenц has been living on Earth for 32 years. I mean, as long as the first Russian immigration itself. And when this short story reached those same immigrants, those who were still alive in 1966, it must have been sorely recognizable, right? And in particular, I mean this passage that we also want to read, but for the lack of time, we won't. Well, never mind. Where he marvels at himself. Anyone remembers Vladislav Khodasevich's famous poem "In Front of the Mirror," written in 1924 in Paris. Я, что за дикое слово. A poem about the reflection not being recognizable to the speaker of the poem, an emigre. It is 50 or so years later, 32 years later. It is essentially the same motif, and his sojourn on Earth, of course, can be interpreted as exile. After all, he's lonely, alienated. He's there involuntarily. Yes, it's a spaceship crash, right, that lands him in the Soviet Union outside of Irkutsk. But this can be, of course, an allegory for some kind of historical cataclysm or catastrophe or crash, which is precisely how the first Russian immigration interpreted 1917, the revolution, the civil war, in the wake of which, or as a result of which, they found themselves elsewhere. Whether or not voluntarily, it's a different question. And at the same time, again, today, it's not only because it's exactly 100 years, right? So, It is kind of a universal of a diasporic identity, and perhaps not only Russian, to not only to preserve one's native language and identity and background, homeland, but also to exaggerate it and to admire it from in absentia, right, from a distance. It is about how one's homeland becomes a utopia, but not a utopia of the future as we are used to thinking utopias of the future, but a utopia of the past. Making someone like our protagonist essentially a ghost, and this is what, for instance, Zinovy Zinnik, the author of several terrific essays about emigration as a literary device, he calls it, эмиграция как литературный прием. Hello, Shklovsky, right? 1917's essay, Art as Device. This is where Zinnik suggests that the character of an emigre is essentially a ghost, who is the undead, one who is always pulled back, drawn back, but is ever invisible, right, by their former compatriots. Pkhence is visible, but he isn't, because he has to hide his 6 pairs of hands, his 8 pairs of eyes, and constantly complains that one pair of eye on his heel gone bad because of the rough kind of Soviet boots that he has to wear all the time, at all times in public. So much of him is invisible, of course. This is what his neighbor Veronica mentioned in these passages several times, does not see. And because of this invisibility, well, there are quite candid physiological descriptions of the female body, for instance, that Pkhence interprets differently. So yeah, I think for this reason, again, not only for historical reasons, not to mention that, of course, Terz, that is Sinyavsky himself, is first exiled to a hard labor camp for 7 years, right? So internal kind of banishment or imprisonment, and then emigrates to Paris in 1973. Not to mention that this textual embodiment of the author, the manuscript of Pkhence, also migrates across the border on its way to the readers, first abroad and then back home. It is all those things. So it's a really multi-layered construction of emigration, if you like. But once again, it's also an ecological reading, right? You can, sure enough, today especially read Pkhence ecologically, with all the greenery that is the body of his mother, the color of his mother's body, and the forest that he longs to embrace or be part of dissolving. The cover of this book is of that color, for that reason.
Thank you. So I'm having a somewhat interesting day, which started at 9 a.m. On Zoom when I interviewed a friend, a colleague, a rival, a person with whom I've been talking for 35 years now in various intonations. But nevertheless, that is an ongoing conversation. And now at 6 p.m., the conversation continues. And one thing that is rather obvious, that we are at a point of very acutely felt transition. Things are changing. Things are very uncertain and rather fragile. As I've mentioned at the beginning, it's been now years that Tamizdat project, led by Yašoj Klotz and realized by basically the team, happens. Where are you now?
Where are we now? Well, we are certainly at a very different place having published this book. Symbolically, I mean, it's hard to describe this feeling, just how differently the material aspect of the whole project feels, right? All of a sudden, especially with a text like this. And also, I should say, especially designed so beautifully by Alexander Sherman, our web designer and also graphic designer, who lives in London. So this project really has become borderless, if only because different people in it live years in Russia, still in Norway. And it kind of lives up to our idea of Tamizdat as kind of contingent upon crossing borders and reconciling borders, not to say bridging, but or to say bridging in the sense that it also disunites and unites. So it's a constant kind of working and articulating the borders, and I hope this is how we kind of make them less, more penetrable, perhaps, and less daunting. It is not so much about geography anymore, of course, as it used to be in the 50s, but it's about more perhaps internalized borders within the same geographical space. Of course, this is the reality of the internet that kind of drove the last nail into the coffin of Tamizdat of the old days, technological reasons, not only politically, right? Because it almost coincided with the fall of Soviet-era censorship and the fall of the Soviet Union. That's when the internet rose. The curtain was lifted, but so rose the internet. If you'd like me to list other things that Nicole is very much a typical representative of Tamizdat project, because it kind of lands people in different places. She was in New York only half a year ago, and now she's in Berkeley. Again, the American continent has been crossed here. But we have a growing physical library of such books, not such books, but Tamizdat, what you can see here in Globus as well, by the way. And these are becoming increasingly precious and interesting for their material qualities, despite the fact, or despite the growing ease, right, of reading these same texts electronically. So this is what this project is kind of perpetuating: print books. Summer schools, oral history interviews, and of course, most importantly, unfortunately, I cannot show it just yet today, but a new website where one major improvement or growth compared to the old one will be so-called realms. By realms, we mean literary traditions, not languages, but literary. Ukrainian, of course, Czech, and so on, all of which, at least in the East European context, had something that may be called Tamizdat, no matter what the actual word etymologically in these languages would be, Tamvidav. And at some point they intersect. I mean, we simply know this, having studied Tamizdat of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They intersected physically, but also largely, for example, at a place called Maison Lafitte, outside of Paris, where Instytut Literacki, the Polish Literary Institute with its journal Kultura, headquartered and still headquarters, and Jerzy Giedroyc, its editor, who published Terz. Terz was first published by a Polish emigre publishing house. Both in Polish, both in translations into other languages. Ukrainian Anthology of Executed Renaissance was first published by Giedroyc. And even the term Executed Renaissance belongs to the Polish publisher. And the second thing that we will be doing, and only starting or embarking on now, is what it's hard to kind of fight this term at this point, new Tamizdat, or simply Tamizdat, meaning books, those that I mentioned earlier, brought out by some 30 or more in their home countries. But here we can only perhaps speak so far only of two such realms, right? Russian and Belarusian, because that's where authors, but texts as well, are unpublishable, and as a result, they are published elsewhere in Warsaw, Berlin, again, Israel, sometimes in the US, but much, much less so than in Europe.
One of the most interesting and I would say confusing things about these matters today, and something that we're discussing actively, is that some of the most important books are still published in Russia by people who dare. And it is a very important and very difficult and very touchy, I would say, question. What can be done in Russia? What cannot? For example, one of the points of my disagreement with Mitya Kuzmin and some other people in this audience were the prizes should exist in Russia at this point. For example, the controversy of Andrei Belый Prize and so on. But dynamics is very different than at the end of the Soviet Union as we feel it now. And very often when we think about censorship as it exists today, very much it's self-censorship. What people dare to publish and what people dare not to publish. And all these considerations give birth to very different ideas, books, disagreements, and so on. So this idea that мы влипли в историю, as Dostoevsky says, that now very much this very moment we are observing, and some of us are making history of a book again. This is a sharp, and as Pkhentz would define it, приятный. It's so endlessly cool that we're at Globus, because for me, Globus and its glorious team, we see books from so many presses here. The world of this volatile world of the Russophone, and not only Russophone.
Born this way. It all started in 1971 with producing Tamizdat literature, but
right, it's also a publishing house.
Yeah. I actually have a question to Yasha as an expert in Tamizdat. So there's a tendency nowadays to call Tamizdat literature an exile. Why is it so? And do they have different qualities, those two terms?
Tamizdat and exile?
Yeah.
To me, yes.
Okay.
Because it's very understandable why people in a precarious situation of exile or in a situation of being published outside of their home countries, even if they themselves have emigrated. Why people use old ready-made terms? Well, because first of all, of the symbolic kind of capital, right? That such words as exile and tamizdat have accumulated over at least 100 years. But at the same time, and for that very reason, of course, it's very misleading and I would say very dangerous self-identity. Emigres in the 1920s, 100 years ago, argued a lot as to just who they were. Изгнанники, эмигранты, relocanti did not exist, but nor does this word exist anymore, I feel, in relation to the fifth wave of immigration. It had its moment for about maybe a year and a half, but then died out. No one uses this anymore. So everyone, of course, uses something that has a much longer history and solid kind of historical footing, for the better, for the worse. But what's obvious is that language is always late, always lags behind. Reality, of course, for that same reason, there was no language to describe siege. No comparisons, but nevertheless, fundamentally new historical experience resists old forms and requires new ones. So the siege, no one knew how to write about it. The Gulag, Holocaust, whatever. World War I. As a result of World War I, modernism appeared, right, as a fundamentally new way of writing. But it kind of takes time. So I personally hope there will be a different term for tamizdat, simply because reality is more different than it is similar. There was no war against any other country in the 1920s by Russia, from which first wave emigres left, right? It was a civil war, but it's a very different type of reason to emigrate. No, again, it's not about what reason was stronger or weaker. It was just different. Yeah, but there is no such term, and frankly, we cannot come up with it, right? That's all we think about, how to call it, what to call it, I'm sorry. And
that's not all we think about.
Well, that's not what we think, all we think about, but it is we think about it often and for a long time, and just nothing comes up.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to encourage everybody to think of a question.
I'm surprised to hear that. Well, actually, it made me think of writing and publishing is not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm surprised not to see much more coming from Russia under pen names, things that are published,
right,
and we don't know who it is. So why are you publishing Pkhence when there are probably tons of Pkhences in Irkutsk, Yekaterinburg, and maybe closer to the border? Are they approaching you with requests for publishing?
Not us, because not Tamizdat project, because if we are not as a publishing house, first and foremost, but as a public scholarship and philanthropic organization for the study of such books, but not for publishing such books. Yet. But you would be surprised how many applications or submissions other publishing houses have. A lot, yes, and mostly, well, yeah, the majority come from Russia. Whether or not under pen names, it's kind of a different question. But of course, this practice is not as widespread, I would say, as in the 1960s. What publishing houses do sometimes, and this is really interesting because there's one publishing house which is kind of the oldest, being only less than 2 years old. Freedom Letters, started by Georgi Rushadze. It's a publishing house that builds on technology, so it's print on demand. Therefore, their books can be published absolutely anywhere, including in Russia, and sold, as long as there is no overt LGBTQ plus thematics, let's say, or characters. It's about characters, not about the theme as such. And what he sometimes does, he puts a false city as the place of communication, false brands of publishing houses, covert projects, sometimes for the purpose of publishing one subversive book, and to prevent, risks for the publishers themselves, for the authors, for the readers, maybe even. So one such, I'm hesitating to call it Tamizdat, but clearly the bestseller of today's, let's call it Tamizdat. Tamizdat is Navalny's memoirs, Patriot. The publishing house was called One Book Publishers. One Book Publishing. False, but it is a special project, right? So sometimes one book carries behind it the entire kind of structure, institution.
Almost one of the things that Tamizdat is doing now, it's trying to look at what is being published.
Right.
And I've seen dozens of books published under pseudonyms or other initials. But also, since we've mentioned, there is this strange feeling of nobody knowing what will happen next. I think books are being written, and also people are thinking whether they want to publish under pseudonyms, actually, because it's a difficult decision, in a way, to stay invisible. And I guess there might be some hesitations on that. One of my life roles, I'm teaching that, and there is something about sensing that there are manuscripts in the process of being born. Эти книги все еще пишутся. And since Yasha mentioned that indeed I studied one particular historical moment of actually Великой Отечественной войны, and there was even certain fever of the начальники культуры и литературы kind of requiring that books should emerge on the subject. But it takes 9 months. We don't know how many months it takes, but I think books are still in the process. But also, since, for example, we can look at poetry, poetry famously is the most reactive literary forms, and we already can make some conclusions about what is going on there. A huge well, this is a metaphor that unfortunately works, a huge explosion of the sentimental war poetry that works, I think, mostly therapeutically. And yet, slowly, step by step, poem by poem, high quality product is coming out. But again, perhaps slower than we need emotionally. And this is a very interesting, I think, phenomenon in terms of how society reacts to the disaster. So I would say patience, it's the only problem. And all my friends are in the same kind of situations.
At the same time, it's what's being produced is extremely volatile and passing. It's only been, again, 2 years, but so many books are no longer possible to find, such as even the anti-war anthologies, right, published by Babel. And, well, yes, of course, anthologies are always popular, but it's just because of the inability for these books have to stay, right, in the moment and to register. They did it, but then something else develops so rapidly and turbulently that once our memory becomes simply very short.
I have a question, sorry, Yasha, from Sasha.
Sure.
I'll stand here. So it's not super weird. This is for both of you. You mentioned your morning argument about the future of Tamizdat. And so I just want to ask, to give us more details for you, but also just what's the future of this new Tamizdat?
As long as we call it Tamizdat, it's not the future, but
Tamizdat 2.0, is that what you're
I
thinking?
disagree. I disagree. I will try to move through the preamble, which is a rather quixotic. I grew up in a family of Birmanistas, especially from Myanmar. And when I came to this country, I attempted to retrace my father, who died many years ago. And I met some amazing poets from Myanmar. And it happened 2022. When I was completely speechless and overwhelmed. And they were kind of puzzled by my state. And the conversation was, so you're surprised that this is happening again? Because in Myanmar, it's coup after coup after coup, basically, and people return to their country, and then something awful happens again. They leave. It's like tides and something. And I think what is happening with me, basically, is understanding that the situation is, I'm afraid to say regular, but circular. And we're with very important changes. It's technological, it's internet. We're dealing with it very strongly. There are other aspects of change, for example, very strange nature of censura that we've been discussing for several evenings now, that basically sama censura is at the center of everything. Of course, there are very important points of difference that we're discussing constantly, but the very nature of this yet another wave, this I think is the strongest shock for me personally. So Tamizdat is not only about the past for me, it's about regularity of the situation. It's about here we go again, basically.
if I may add, it's also, of course, about what goes on and has been going on. Unfortunately, will probably go on a much, much larger scale if we stop thinking of Tamizdat as a kind of Russian, Soviet, East European phenomenon. There is South America. There is today, of course, China, with its emigration and with its banned books, and you name it. And unfortunately, the number of these places in the world tends to drastically increase. And banned books in the US is no longer a revelation to anyone, largely because of what PEN America is doing as a long-lasting project of tracing books banned state by state. But today it's on a rather
And
federal
PEN
level, I'm
America
afraid.
being in trouble itself.
Well,
It's an organization, so it's controversy on controversy.
yeah. So,
Yes, I just wanted to piggyback on what you mentioned. I'm from Iran.
Mhm.
And as we were talking about all of this, I was like, I don't know of a bookstore like this or of a space
Mhm.
where people come together and use literature as a tool to reflect about, the place they have left or the place they want to go back to. So I was curious, since you mentioned all these other countries, I know that Spanish-speaking authors get just published in America, but do you know of the concept of tamizdat, or whatever it may be called, specific, that is popular among Chinese or people from South America?
Well, unfortunately, I don't know enough about it, so I can't really use examples on a representative scale. But certainly, I had Nicole knows the student as well, where I teach at Hunter College, who came and really was very excited to start the Chinese version of Tamizdat project.
Okay. So that was my comment, that I feel like there is the concept of putting all of this under the umbrella of one name, so that it's
what name is it going to be?
Yeah,
that's the whole question.
It's interesting that it seems to be part of this heritage of I don't know, you want to call it Slavic, Russian, however you want to call it, and somehow, at least based on my limited knowledge, other people, even though they've had many immigrants, they haven't come together under this umbrella. So
yeah, well, we're all coming, some of us here are coming from a conference at Stanford just on these topics. And the oldest, if we only take Slavic traditions, right, the oldest is, of course, Poland, because it goes back to at least 1830, right? The first Polish or Polish-Lithuanian uprisings. And that's what made possible such phenomenon as, the first 19th century kind of Russian tamizdat of the 19th century. The word never existed. It wasn't called such, but the phenomenon existed with most support from the Polish diaspora. I mean, Alexander Kertzen and first Russian books ever published outside Tsarist Russia at the time, because there was also censorship in Tsarist Russia. So tamizdat, yes, it's maybe it's not the best term for a project that ambitiously looks not only at the present and at the recent past, but also the distant past, as well as at different geopolitical contexts, kind of sidewise. Yeah, but we don't have a.
Maybe one last comment on that, because my comment was not so much about the organization, but just about the concept itself. That as an Iranian, I'm like, well, we need that. Why don't we have that? Or I'm thinking about a lot of people from Arab countries. I don't know of such a thing. They didn't even think of the concept, or they couldn't bring it together. So it was very interesting that here it's an established thing. Hopefully we can have something like that, whatever we end up calling it, or
Yes, hopefully.
There's another question.
I was just wondering, you mentioned in response to an earlier question, modernism resulting from the traumas of World War I, and it made me think about whether there's anything generalizable that can be said about the aesthetics of tamizdat and the trauma of immigration, exile, whatever term you want to use it.
Which tamizdat?
Well, I mean, that's sort of the I guess implicit follow up, whether it is the experience of that sort of can trace an aesthetic movement that goes from the 60s to the contemporary moment, or if it is ultimately a product. Because in the experience of отстранение or estrangement, is like one that has continued throughout, or whether it is really a product of the period in which it's written.
Well, Polina can speak much more, much more informed way about what aesthetic forms or trends or kind of breakthroughs maybe this new Tamizdat has, or the historical reality behind it, has produced in poetry, but to my kind of amateur eye, it is a fundamentally new period in Russian poetry, I think, in the past 3 years. If you read it, or as all of us did back in the spring 22, what Lenor Goralik would publish month by month in ROAR, right? This is the first publication of the new Tamizdat. Online or not, it does not matter that much. If you really read it, the poetry section, I had not read anything like this before, so it's an impression. It's not maybe informed enough, but this is definitely something new. It's very broken language, of course, very fragmented, very self-destructive, but also some of it very sentimental, as Polina mentioned, and emotional. So it's a kind of fiery mix of a lot of things. In prose, I don't think, not yet. I'm not sure. It's very hard to generalize. I think we are, as a project that aims to devote some attention to this new Tamizdat, we are only at the stage when all we can do is bibliography, documenting what gets published, what gets reviewed, maybe attempt to review such books. Of course, that's a tremendously important step, because this pushes us to think analytically about not just a specific book, but about what stands behind it, where it comes from. But I'm not sure. I'm sure there are lots of discussions already attempting to give a generalized picture or some conclusions, but it probably seems too early. And all Tamizdat, it's kind of, unfortunately, I think it's married to the concept of dissident literature, which is kind of an oxymoronic expression, but it's still perceived through this prism today, and casts this shadow on what's being written today as well.
I don't know how much more informed.
Much more time.
Yeah, well, I think we can handle a couple more questions.
Okay, let's handle.
Yeah, but I have a question about the Ukrainian authors that are forced to be published in Tamizdat.
Today?
Yes, like Russophone authors who cannot be printed in Ukraine for the reason because they use Russian language to write, and they absolutely cannot be printed in Russia because they belong to our enemy country. Do they have like any specific category within the Tamizdat, or like what's the future of their works?
Problematic.
But
and I think this is something. There are several zones of anxiety within the situation where everything is a zone of anxiety, and this is one of them, I would say. And there are all kinds of conversations among people who make books today, where these texts will emerge. And I just talked to Igor Belsky as one of the champions of this situation. Yeah. And another situation, answering to Yana's question, one of the situations that I find very interesting is that what we have is some kind of rapprochement, or maybe a truce, перемирие, between the avant-gardists and authors of the popular poetry, pleasant poetry. authors of the unpleasant poetry and authors of the pleasant poetry. They're kind of maybe not talking to each other, but they decided to become a little bit more patient towards each other. And it's interesting to observe. And also there is even a suspicion that maybe they're secretly reading each other. Because there are some kind of moments of congeniality there. But also, as I discussed with Yasha at some point, what is being overlooked perhaps is something extremely crucial, the work of the youngest. Maybe going back also to your question, since kind of the masters had opportunity to leave, I don't know, Sorokins of this world and other people of this world, but people in the early 20s are very much stuck in Moscow, Petersburg, and many, many other cities, Vladivostok and whatnot, without journals, without places to congregate, and so on. And they are the future of the language. Maybe they're even the present of the language. So who will publish their books? It's also an interesting question. Because first, somebody should make their zines. Each of them first should publish a bad book, right? I just told Google, we had a whole session about how important it is to have a first failure. Speaking of bookmaking, who will publish their first failures before they come up? And there is a gap there. There is Ziania. So these are all good and difficult and rather unpleasant questions, I would say. But overall, it's an exciting and unpleasant situation that I remind myself all the time, whatever we're talking about catastrophe.
But speaking of new Tamizdat, once again, of course, this would be the space for Russophone or not Russophone Ukrainian authors to for the Russian language readership, for those who are interested in reading it, Ukrainian poetry, no matter in which language, to be able to read it in the publications of these new publishing houses. So it is something that Mitya Kuzmin is actually doing, except he's not publishing contemporary Ukrainian author Tarnavsky, but
Freedom
again,
Letters,
someone
Freedom Letters prints some of them.
Freedom Letters does too, right?
Yeah.
They have a series, but yeah, it's on a very small scale,
Yep.
which has its practical reasons, of course, as we understand, and ideological and other technical, probably. But yeah, it's something that is really like this gaping.
Okay, let's have one more question and we'll wrap up the official. Yeah, please.
Yes, this question was quickly melt over. I have to, well, it's not a question, maybe it's a statement. Before that time, I apologize because I came to this country in already half of my life, and my English maybe is not as comfortable as my Russian, because I love my Russian language as my native first primary language. But anyway, about samizdat and about censor. So censura is always going together with the samizdat. So samizdat was being founded because there was a censura, government censura, which is force people, writer, developer of the literature, to get another way to publishing his job. There is a precedent of several during the Soviet Union time. Of course, there was a strong censure over there. And there was several authors, literature authors, who was basically abused as a professional poets and writers in Soviet Union. They emigrate to United States, and they was absolutely sure then there is no censure in the United States. So when they start to publishing what they want to publish, and they was picked in the many, not all, but in many newspapers. That time the internet was not, it was 80s. So they was dissident in Soviet Union, they emigrated to United States. And it happened in New York. They went to the top American newspapers, and they found that there is a censure over there, and not let them publishing that their
it's a very
yes.
It's a very I'm answering you
right. I don't remember, unfortunately, the name of this
publisher. But it was very common.
They was standing in front of the publishing place of the newspaper with big placards and with advertising over there. And after several days, the FBI agent came to them, and he told me, "Okay, guys, you know what? It's time you to go home." And the people who was just walking on the street, they walked nearby this group of Russian writers, and they say, "You guys, you are Russian propaganda." They walk out. So my point is, the country exists, and we cannot have total freedom of publishing because the samizdat in publishing is an element of proxy wars. With works, it's a war with using the brain of people and reprogramming the people of their own needs of the other countries. Again, sorry for my English because it's my second language.
I think the point you raised is actually very important because it is very symptomatic of the problem of readjusting to a new reality, to a new market, to a new, you can call it censorship, but simply economic reality. And this is certainly something that every immigrant or diasporic community experiences, especially authors who are not used to be ignored and who are
in each country, it doesn't matter, it's totally country or less totalitarianistic country or more totalitarianistic countries, they're supposed to be a censure because you cannot publish anything you want, which is because this affects the people's brain. It affects the people's mind, the mind of society. The same things after internet being developed, after Facebook being developed, after all kind of other methods of publishing, online publishing. There's still censure. For example, I feel strong censure in the Facebook, which I use, and I don't know if all of you guys feel that. But I feel you cannot publish anything you want and whatever words you want. So this is what's reality.
Thank you for the comment. Yeah, okay. I think we can wrap up the official part, but please feel free to ask a personal question, any of our speakers.
And
grab a book and
get an
autograph. Thank you.